Becoming the crocodile. If you stand only on the safety of the banks, spearing fish, how can you know the depths of the river? Can you fathom the darkness under a ledge of rock, or understand the life of the fish writhing on your spear? You mistake the teeth of the crocodile as the edge of the abyss, but the chasm is more terrible than teeth and certain. I fulfill the law, and the law demands your blood. I am Sebek, the crocodile, the catastrophe, the devourer, the necessity. Impaled on my teeth, you shall be blessed, for you will glimpse truth. I am only the secrets of your own dark heart, your lust, your greed, your anger, your flesh, to tear the darkness from your heart. I am the living power of water, the cry that catches in the throat, the sob that shatters stone. On my teeth you smell the stink of flesh. To you I seem a living horror. But I tell you in truth, I am your own soul, and it is with great sorrow that I crush the life you have made. I weep with the loss, but you do not believe. Such destruction is madness, you say. You do not understand. Is it madness to cut the wheat so that bread can be made? When you were born in this bright land, did you not weep for the lost dark of the womb? Whether or not you understand the law, you exist because of it. When you've reached the lips of the great devourer, you are staring into the jaws of creation.
Anthony, how did you first become interested in the concept of death?
Well, I suppose it's one of those things in our lives that it is always there, isn't it? It's always the darkness in the corner. It's the greatest mystery of life, and it's the one inevitability of life, that and taxes. And it's one of the things that has always fascinated me, because I knew that I was inevitably going to die, and everybody that I loved and everybody I knew was going to die. And we seem to spend all our lives avoiding that reality. The whole of particularly Western society seems to exist in order to ignore that fact and pretend it is not there. I mean, earlier societies lived with death tooth and jowl with the way people live their lives. But I really wanted to understand exactly what death was, and whether there was a possibility that the way in which death was understood to take place was in error. In other words, could one apply modern science and modern neurology and come up with something completely different about the idea of what happens to human consciousness when it dies? And literally, that's what I started to do around about 10 years ago now. I decided to start reading up on the subject, and I found that there was an awful lot of evidence to conclude that what happens to consciousness at death is quite different to what most people believe it to be.
And when exactly, or was it more of a process, when did you have that amazing moment very few people undergo, when both the mystical and the material, the scientific and the supernatural, converge at a crossroads, and the universe, well, it becomes more intriguing in all these aspects? When did it happen?
I suppose it was funnily enough, and I mean, this is interesting, and it directly relates to one of the other people that you have featured in your interviews, Timothy Freak. Because what happened was my mother-in-law bought me a copy of the Jesus Mysteries. Now, what I'd done is I'd been reading around the scientific side of things for around about a year, 18 months, and I've been looking into phenomena such as deja vu and near-death experience and everything else. But something was missing, and I wasn't quite sure what it was, because what I was starting to do was to move into areas that implied dualism, but not dualism in the sense of the philosophical sense of the idea of spirit and material world. It was more dualism of human consciousness. I was having a difficulty in understanding guidance that we receive in one way or another. And I was on holiday. Myself and my wife went on holiday to Greece, and we were in a beautiful little place on the Peloponnese called Stupa. Really lovely. It has this great historical feel. And again, you on the Mediterranean, you have this great depth of history. You feel it oozes out of the ground around you. And I started reading the Timothy Freke book and the Peter Gandy book, the Jesus Mysteries. As I started reading it started to make sense to me. And suddenly, because these guys very much take the approach from the idea of the Gnostic belief systems, and they introduced to me the concept of the Daemon and the Eidolon. It suddenly clicked. And I recall looking out over the mountains, looking towards Sparta in ancient Greek, the ancient Greek city of Sparta, and towards Mistras, which, if you've ever been, is the most beautiful Byzantine city. And it suddenly all clicked. And it was like one of these incredible moments where suddenly the light enters you. You suddenly feel that everything suddenly makes sense. And I remember my mouth going very dry and thinking, oh my God, that is the final bit of the jigsaw puzzle. And I remember writing notes after notes after notes about this, because the whole Daemon and Eidolon idea explained to me one factor of my theory, my hypothesis, which I call cheating the ferryman, which we'll discuss in due course, maybe in another interview possibly as we expand onto this thing. But it was very much the idea that the cheating the ferryman suddenly made sense. And ironically enough, when I got back to England, I contacted Tim, and wonderfully he responded to me. I explained to him in a degree of detail exactly what my hypothesis was suggesting. And he said, I think you need to send your material to my literary agent, Susan Mears, which I did. And Susan then subsequently took me on as a writer on her roster. But it was very much Tim's guidance. I suddenly started applying Gnosticism to my ideas and my hypotheses, and such concepts as as the hymn of the pearl and things like that. Suddenly I could see the symbolism within that, the symbolism suggesting that we have a part of us, a sliver of light that's entrapped within the physical body, that is part of the pleroma, part of the greater universe. And that sliver of light I call the Daemon, and I suggest that I actually do the neurology to show exactly how that can be. And whereas guys like yourself and the mystics of the Gnostic tradition have known this for a long time. Because I then started looking into the Cathars, and I suddenly found that even the Cathars had this wonderful concept of duality within their belief system. And I even came to the conclusion, possibly, and I'm still quite strong on this one, that I think that the concept of the Holy Grail is not the bloodline of Christ. It's not the chalice that actually contained the blood of Christ. It's the secret that we are all dual beings, and that we have this being within us that we call the Daemon.
Of course, we'll explore your thesis and your ideas as we go along, but it seems that a simple way of explaining it you do by simply comparing your work to the movie Groundhog Day.
I do.
Could you tell us a little bit about Groundhog Day and how it catalyzed your ideas?
Yes, Groundhog Day is a movie that was very, very popular, and indeed is still popular, and is shown regularly on both terrestrial and satellite television. And it was written by a guy called Danny Rubin. And in the movie Groundhog Day, what you have is a scenario whereby there is a guy called Phil Connors, and he's a weatherman. He is sent up to Punxsutawney, or down, I suppose, to Punxsutawney in Pennsylvania to cover the annual February celebration where the locals take a groundhog called Punxsutawney Phil. And the groundhog, they wake the groundhog up. And if the groundhog goes back to sleep, the legend goes that you're going to have another 6 weeks of winter weather. But if the groundhog wakes up, clearly you're going to have an early spring. That's the background to the story. But effectively what happens is they get snowed in, and Phil is forced to stay an extra night in Punxsutawney. When he wakes up the next morning, the same tune is playing on the radio, and it's Sonny and Cher's I've Got You, Babe. He listens to the radio and he thinks, my God, the idiots, they're actually talking about the same things they talked about yesterday. And as he goes outside his room, he bumps into somebody who sings that was said to him the day before. And he suddenly realizes, or it slowly dawns on him, that he's living the previous day over again. And he finds that he has to go out and do the show again about Punxsutawney Phil. And he thinks at first that everybody's joking with him. But what happens is that he goes through the show and he goes to bed that night and wakes up, and I've Got You, Babe is again playing on the radio. And what has happened is he's been caught in a time loop. He lives the same day over and over and over again. Now, initially what he does is he realizes, after a bit of trauma, that this is massively to his advantage, because he realizes that he has knowledge that people around him do not have. And he uses that for personal gain. He tries to bed the girl, he tries to rob a bank, he does lots of things. But he never gets satisfied by this, because every day he wakes up and it's the same day. And then he starts to try and commit suicide, and there's fantastic sequences of dozens of different suicide events that he tries to do. And every time he commits suicide, he wakes up the next morning. Over many, many, many days, now we're talking literally hundreds or even thousands, because during the movie he teaches himself how to play the piano, he teaches himself various languages, he knows every word that everybody's going to say during the day. And then it dawns on him that he suddenly can do this, he can do good. And he finds himself positioning himself in places where people have accidents around the town. So he ends up underneath the tree of a little lad that falls out of a tree, and he tries to save the life of a tramp. And then when he reaches that perfection almost, that position where he's become a perfect human being, he wakes up the next morning, and it is the next morning. Now, I thought that was a wonderful analogy of what life is. And I thought to myself, could it be that this is what really happens in life? Could it be that what happens is that we do live our lives over and over again, not as a Groundhog Day, but as a Groundhog Life? Now, as you may be aware, there is an area of philosophy and an area of writing for many, many years that's been popular, called something called the eternal return or the eternal recurrence. Friedrich Nietzsche was somebody who suggested this, as did Peter Ouspensky, the Russian philosopher. And the idea of that is that we do indeed, when we die, live our lives again in a literal recreation of our original lives. But some of us realize that this is happening and try to change our lives, as Phil Connors does. And in fact, this is the central thesis of my books, because what I do, the science of how this could be possible. I do the neurology of how this could be possible. And believe me, it works, which is amazing.
You would say that perhaps death is really not the right word. What should we call it? Consciousness?
Yes. What I suggest is that we have confused what death is. We perceive other people's deaths, and we assume that they've actually died and gone somewhere else. Whereas what I argue is that in the final moments of everybody's life, they fall out of time. A cocktail of drugs within the brain, particular forms of neurotransmitters, and one specific neurotransmitter called glutamate, it is known that this floods the brain at the point of death. It also is known to flood the brain during times of crisis. This is why people turn around and say, I was in an accident and everything slowed down around me. I was in a car crash and suddenly everything slowed down. Now, I suggest that at the point of death, this chemical does do exactly what it says. It does slow down time. So in other words, as you look at somebody as they're dying, they're already existing in a different time space to you. In other words, what you perceive as a second, for them is 70 years or 50 years or wherever their lifetime has been. Because I use the argument, if you ever, the alarm goes off in the morning and you turn the alarm off and you put it on snooze. And in that minute or two, you can go into dream state and have a whole dream that could last for hours and hours and hours in that 2 minutes between the two alarms. And again, I have lots of evidence about this. And interestingly enough, evidence from medical analyses, because particularly individuals who are involved, who have, I don't want to use the term have temporal lobe epilepsy, they experience temporal lobe epilepsy, which is a form of epilepsy, and they fall out of time regularly. I have temporal lobe epileptics on my forum who mention this very, very often. So clearly there is something into this. So death is something that doesn't happen to anybody, not initially anyway. In other words, something happens with time at the moment of death, which means in your universe, the person is seen to die, but in their own, they don't. And that will happen to you in the final moments of your life as well.
So your life work is basically to reconcile science and the mystic. You truly believe that both can work together, even though in this society they've become more and more separate. It must be a struggle for you, isn't it?
It is to a certain extent, but it's surprising. It's going to be fascinating in a few weeks' time, because I've been invited to do a talk at the Liverpool University Agnostics group, atheist group. And I've been told they're going to give me quite a hard time. I think they're only going to give me a hard time because they don't understand where I'm coming from. I guarantee they are thinking that I'm some fairly lightweight person who thinks that I talk to dead people or whatever. They're going to be horribly surprised when, whichever area they want to go into, I'm very capable of putting my arguments forward in a particularly strong and reasoned way. And I've found that skeptics who come along to my talks tend to see my point of view. It's because my point of view is totally rationalistic. I never move away from known science. And they find that very hard to deal with. Because what I point out to them is that the mystery of consciousness, science can't explain consciousness. Science cannot. You can take the human brain and you can take it apart bit by bit, but you'll never find a thought. It's because there is some difference as to what it is to be consciously aware. There is something in my head doing the processing. There's something in your head and the listener's heads processing my words and taking into account those words. Science can't explain that. So in which case there has to be an area where mysticism, and all I'd argue is that mysticism is just science we don't understand. We are misinterpreting the evidence we are seeing. In other words, there is an alternate reality out there. It's just that our present scientific paradigm can't measure it, can't quantify it, because we're thinking in the wrong way. If we started thinking as the mystics think and bring together the mystics and the scientists, you'd suddenly find that there's a lot more in common in many ways, and that's my life's aim. I'm a member of various organizations that are trying to bridge this. The Scientific and Medical Network, for instance, is an organization that's trying to do this. The Institute of Noetic Sciences is another, and the Society for Psychical Research. All these organizations are made up of scientists and lay people who are trying to break out of this paradigm and moving people forward into a greater paradigm where we will understand exactly what it is to be alive and to be conscious.
And ultimately, Anthony, what is exactly your goal? To keep joining both mysticism and science? What are your expectations through your research?
My goal is to develop a completely new paradigm of how we perceive reality. I'm not alone in this. There are a lot of other people. I'm just part of a greater movement, I would say. And in many ways, I sometimes pinch myself and actually think, why me? Why now? How has this happened? How has this come about? I'm actually known by my readers as Anthony Why Me Peake, because I'd never really intended for this. I never thought that anybody other than my mother and my family would read my book, let alone 30-odd thousand people across the world. And it's been translated into many different languages now, my first book. And more people are joining all along. And I think that we are all being drawn together. It was a word we used earlier on. We're being drawn together into an egregore, a kind of a collective consciousness whereby we're all adding to this. I'm really pleased to hope to think that the catalyst that will bring this about is my whole cheating the ferryman hypothesis. And that's my ultimate aim, is to... Because I always say to people, I don't know I'm right. I'm out there talking and lecturing to people because I want their input. I want them to say, no, you've got this little bit wrong. But thus far, it seems to be fairly watertight. And that never ceases to amaze me. I was talking only recently to a retired professor of psychiatry about schizophrenia and what schizophrenia is, for instance. And he said, we don't understand the workings of the brain. We pretend to. And I think the brain is the secret. I think the brain is the nexus point between the world of particle physics and the world of reality. And I think if we start looking inside the brain and the processes within the brain, that's where the mysteries lie. That's where the magic lies.
But what do you mean by looking inside the brain, Anthony? In your book, you discuss how the brain is more of, it's a receptor, and consciousness kind of takes what the brain gives us. That's why we get that distorted time. Are we even close to knowing where how the brain plays of it? I know in the ancient times they thought it was the pineal gland.
Yep.
What secrets do the brain has, as far as you found out?
The major challenge that modern neurology has is the interface between consciousness, which seems to be non-physical, and the brain itself, which is a physical system that works along mechanical or chemical ways. But the chemicals and the mechanisms within the brain cannot explain consciousness. So the question is consciousness what's termed an epiphenomenon of the brain, i.e. it is an integral part of the evolution of the brain? Or is it something different? For instance, there's a lot of suggestions these days that the brain is a receiver, like a radio is a receiver. In other words, you and I have the impression that we are in our heads purely and simply because we perceive the world through our eyes and we hear things through our ears. So therefore, inevitably, our worldview will be looking out through our eyes, because that's what happens. I mean, for instance, I know that if people spend a lot of time playing computer games where they take the role of an avatar within a 3D computer world, it's very difficult to disassociate yourself from the viewpoint on the screen. It's as if your consciousness is in two places at the same time. Now, I argue that the illusion that consciousness is in the brain is brought about by that. But that is not to say that the brain is not absolutely integral in making you and I who we are. Because we know perfectly well if I have brain damage or you have brain damage of any sort, it changes your personality, it changes your perceptions. So clearly the brain and consciousness have a very close relationship. But consciousness seems to work in a different way. And there's been some work done at the moment by a guy called Stuart Hamerhoff and an English philosopher called Roger Penrose, who are suggesting that consciousness is actually directly to do with quantum physics, and it's a quantum physics effect within the brain. In other words, the brain itself collapses something called the wave function, which I'll go into in greater detail in another talk because I'd have to do the background to explain that to the listeners. But suffice to say, your brain and the thing behind your eyes is known to be the most complex thing in the universe. And it's sitting a few inches behind your eyes, which is phenomenal. It's a phenomenal idea to think that even the complexity of a sun or a galaxy moving around is nothing to the complexity of what's going on within your brain.
Yeah, it is fascinating, because isn't it true that once a person dies, the brain is very busy for many hours after the person dies, isn't it? I mean, it's getting ready for something.
Yeah, there seems to be evidence that there's a big argument at the moment, because I'm researching a book on out-of-body experiences at the moment, so I'm going into a great deal of detail about this. And the big debate is exactly when brain death takes place. You know, at what point do we know that the brain has ceased to function? And and effectively it has been shown that even though the body has died, and for instance, there are certain surgical techniques nowadays where literally the body is killed. The body is brought down to, I think it's 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and the blood is stopped, the heart is stopped, it stops breathing. But the brain is almost flatlined, but it's still functioning in some way. So clearly the brain is an entity that is of a massive mystery, and we're only just starting to understand exactly how it works and how it processes information even. There is an ongoing mystery, for instance, about the idea of where it all comes together within the brain, because you're listening now to my voice and you're seeing things around you, but they're being processed at different speeds. But you have the concept of simultaneity, that everything is happening at the same moment, whereas in reality it isn't. We know, for instance, that the brain functions at around about 0.5 of a second behind reality. In other words, it buffers information before it's presented to consciousness. So effectively there is a mystery. And there was a program on television over in the UK recently, which showed that this can be up to 6 minutes between us physically being aware of something and it happening. Now that's mind-blowing stuff, because it means it means the reality out there is not the reality we think it is. The reality is mind-generated. It's what the famous Gnostic William Blake called the mind-forged manacles. It's the idea that the reality we perceive is what the brain allows us to perceive. As again Blake said, if the doors of perception were cleansed, what would we then see? The brain doesn't allow us to perceive everything, but it allows the Daemon to perceive everything. And that's one of my arguments, that the Daemon does perceive everything. It's just the Eidolon that doesn't.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because taking it even to its further conclusion, and we can talk about it in our next show, but that's bringing the whole precognition, because basically we are actually not looking at the future, but we're actually looking at the past.
Correct.
And there are people who could be looking further into the past, which is basically predicting the future, right?
Correct. And when people have precognitions, I have a regular radio slot on BBC Radio Merseyside here. And one of the things I talked about a few weeks ago was precognition. And I was arguing quite strongly and getting evidence from the listeners who were listening in that precognition is a memory. You don't precog, as Philip K. Dick would call it. You're remembering the last time you lived this life. And your Daemon is warning you, because for the Daemon, it's a memory. And the Daemon says, woof, I remember last time that we did this happened. And it warns you to avoid these circumstances, which is a very different angle on what precognition could be. And again, my cheating the Ferryman hypothesis is, as quite a few people have said, one of the most satisfying explanations for precognition that's ever been written, because it suggests that all you're doing is remembering the fact. It also is a very effective explanation for another similar phenomenon called déjà vu.
Yeah, or of course, again, bringing in Philip K. Dick, that total recall.
Totally, yeah, absolutely. Wonderful book and wonderful movie. We can recall it all for you wholesale, wasn't it? Yeah, exactly, because Philip K. Dick, as you know, Philip K. Dick is a massive influence on me in terms of his writing rather than his science. But it was his philosophy and his writing. That guy got it right. It disturbs me, the levels that guy got it right. Indeed, in a later talk, I'll be happy to expand on exactly. And I know that Tessa Dick has been on your show here as well, and Tessa has read my book on the Daemon, which has a whole chapter on Phil. And I know that she was fascinated by the angles I was taking on this.
She was a first-hand person to
Totally.
A lot of Dick's visions and predictions. She was there.
She was, and again, she's a member of my forum as well. And delighted when she became involved there, because we have a lot of dickheads on there as well, who, and funnily enough, I did a lecture at Nottingham Trent University last year on Philip K. Dick as part of they have an annual Philip K. Dick Day there. And I did a lecture on precognition, which was funnily enough published in the magazine The Gnostic, which you interviewed Tessa in that, didn't you, in the last edition?
I can see you right now! These guys can't open
up. If the sky were to suddenly open up, there would be no law, there would be no rule. There would only be you and your memories, the choices you've made, and the people you've touched. If this world were to end, there would only be you and him and no one else.
I hope that when the world comes to an end, I can breathe a sigh of relief, because there will be so much to look forward to.
If you do not know the present, how can you claim to know the future?
I'm prophetic, not infallible.
Well, what if there is no tomorrow? There wasn't one today.
Every passing minute is another chance to turn it all around.
Well, what if there is no tomorrow? There wasn't one today.
Man only has one lifetime, but history can remember you forever.
Every passing minute is another chance to turn it all around.
There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy.
We can never surpass the choices we don't understand.
Besides death, Anthony, which we discuss in our last entry of Schrodinger's diary, the future might be the second most important issue on people's mind, consciously or unconsciously. It happens every day, from people reading their horoscope, to making goals, to statistically planning their lives to the smallest degree. The future is very important. Why is the future important in your hypotheses of cheating the Ferryman and the Daemon?
The future is central because the future, for many of us, has already happened. In other words, the future is a memory rather than something that is about to happen to us. And the higher self, the Gnostic term I use of the Daemon, which is very, very similar to the terminology you guys use, is the being that knows the future. And the being is aware of the future, and it will guide your Eidolon to make the right decisions, or indeed sometimes choose not to do so because it knows the outcome of any events and any things you do, because everything's a knock-on effect. It's rather like if you've seen the movie The Butterfly Effect. Same kind of principle applies. Little things that you do now can spread out through your life and change things radically. So the Daemon is aware of these changes, and it will advise you as well as best it can to warn you what to do or what not to do. And this is where precognition, my argument, comes from.
So precognition is basically, there are myriad amounts of futures that you can take, and your Daemon or your higher self is the one, if you listen to it, can guide you to correct futures.
Correct. It's rather analogous to a super three-dimensional first-person computer game in which everything that can happen has been programmed into the game itself. So therefore, every decision you make is already programmed in there, and you follow that route or another route. It's a subject we can probably touch on later in another talk, which is the many worlds interpretation of particle physics. But effectively, it suggests that every possible outcome of every event is already out there in what's called the hyperverse.
And how would you define the precognition? Would you simply define it as remembering the future from all the research you've done?
Correct. That's exactly what I would define it as remembering the future. In my books, I cite many examples of absolutely evidence that people see the future and take action to change it. I mean, one of my favorite stories of this one, and if you've not heard it before, it's really quite amazing. It took place at the end of the 19th century, no, probably the end of the 18th century, I think. It was probably earlier than that. There was a guy called Robert Morris Sr., and he was an American agent for a Liverpool shipping firm. He was to find fame because he was one of the framers of the American Constitution. But something very curious happened. He was in the harbour of Oxford in Maryland, and he had a vivid dream the night before. And in the dream, he saw events that ended up with him receiving a mortal wound from a salvo fired in his honour. The next day, he spoke to the captain of the ship, and the ship was ironically enough called the Liverpool, and he said to the captain, "Look, I've had this weird dream that seems to be warning me I'm going to get killed. So can you please ensure that no salvo takes place?" And the captain turned round, a guy called Captain Matthews, and he said, "No, that's fine. We will make sure that the crew do not do the customary salute for you." And then Morris thought about this, and he agreed, and he decided he'd go along to the reception. As the reception went on, the captain turned around and said, "Well, maybe the crew are still keen to do the salute to you. Maybe if they did it when you were already off the ship, and you were in safety's danger's way, and then they can fire the salvo then." And he said, "Yeah, that'll be fine, I will do that." So as he was getting onto the boat to leave the main boat, a fly landed on his nose, and he scratched it. And as he moved his hand, they came to the conclusion, the people in the crew thought it was the signal to fire the salvo. So they fired it, and a piece of shrapnel flew off the gun and actually hit him on the leg. And 2 days later, he died because it killed him. So effectively, his precognition and his dream came true, even though he tried to make sure it didn't happen. So it was clear that he had some kind of pre-warning of a danger.
But that shows us that sometimes we cannot change the future, or can we change the future?
Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. It really depends. And sometimes you get some curious events where people have dreams of the future that the actual dream itself brought about the circumstances whereby the events took place. An example of this was there was a lady in London, and again, it's about 150 years ago. She had a very vivid dream, and in the dream she dreamt that she was being chased by a monkey. And this was in London. She dreamed she was in the streets of London. There was a monkey chasing her. So the next morning she wakes up and she says to her husband, I had this weird dream about a monkey and I hate monkeys. And she was so worried about it, the husband turned around and said, go out today, go for a walk along the Regent's Canal, get yourself to calm down. She never normally walked down the Regent's Canal, but she decided that day she would do it. So she goes off and walks down the Regent's Canal, and as she's doing so, she sees a monkey climbing from tree to tree. Now this is England and there are no monkeys here. And what had happened was a monkey had escaped from a local private zoo that afternoon, and it was subsequently recaptured. But if the woman had not gone on the walk along the river, along the bank, she would not have seen the monkey, and the only reason she went on the walk was because she had a dream involving a monkey. So it was as if that fulfilled itself by her changing her actions. So clearly there's much evidence that within dreams and within general sensations and feelings, we perceive the future. In my book, The Daemon, I've received lots and lots of letters from people around the world who read the first book and wanted to give me their experiences. Now, there's one guy who said his daemon is so precognitive that it's with him all the time. And he gave one example whereby, because I don't know if you know, but the non-dominant hemisphere of the brain, which I think is where the daemon is located, usually works if you are right-handed. The non-dominant hemisphere normally works with the left-hand side of the body. And under given circumstances, the left hemisphere of the brain can move your left leg or your left arm. And this guy was walking across the shop floor of a factory in America. And as he was walking along, he had a cup of coffee in his hand. And suddenly his left hand came up and covered the mug of the coffee. And as it did so, a huge dollop of oil hit the top of his hand. And as he said to me, he said that proves that my daemon is so aware of what I'm doing, it even knew that a blob of oil was going to land in a cup of coffee.
Yeah, and it seems, as you mentioned, that dreams do play a big part in precognition. I'm assuming that's because the Aeon itself is sort of receded. What other states of, or what other altered states of consciousness are inducive to bringing the demon and therefore precognition?
I would say that there's a state called, there's deep dreaming, where you have proper dreams. There is also a sub-dreaming state, which is called hypnagogia. If it's just before you go to sleep, when you're not quite asleep, where your Eidolon is semi-aware, but demonic consciousness starts to come in, but your Eidolon is aware of it. You know, sometimes you get fleeting images, or you hear sounds, or see things. And that's called hypnagogic imagery. If it happens when you've just woken up, it's called hypnopompic imagery. Now, during that time, the channels of communication between the daemon and the Eidolon are more open. And I have evidence from mediums that have spoken to me that they argue this is the kind of brain state they get into when they communicate with their spirit guides. Now, again, I'd use the same argument that mediums misinterpret the messages they get, thinking they're spirit guides, when in fact they're their daemon. And under those circumstances, somebody can be in a semi-wake state and can either hear the voice of the daemon or can see images that the daemon has put in their mind. I also suggest that during deep states of people who do yoga, people who do meditation, they can open up these channels of communication as well by going into deep mental states and altered states of consciousness. And again, the daemon can speak through them. Also, I suggest that there are certain neurological illnesses is the wrong term, and I hate to use the term illness, but there are certain neurological perceptions that also can open up demonic communication. And I suggest migraine is one of them. I suggest that temporal lobe epilepsy is another. And when the communication channels are fully open, and the Eidolon is experiencing the world that the daemon experiences, the world of the pleroma, the world behind the world, that's schizophrenia, and it literally drives the schizophrenic seemingly mad, because they're an Eidolonic consciousness perceiving the reality behind reality, and it drives them crazy. And in these circumstances, again, it is a well-known fact, and I've spoken to psychiatrists about this, including one of the world's leading authorities on schizophrenia, and schizophrenics are known to be precognitive. It's one of the things that happens in schizophrenia. Sometimes they are out of time by about a minute or so, and sometimes they make prognostications about the future. Now, temporal lobe epileptics, historically, by the way, temporal lobe epilepsy in the past used to be known as the diviner's disease, because they knew that people who had temporal lobe epilepsy were particularly effective at foreseeing the future. In fact, shamans, many shamans that you talk to, you will find that one of the things that shamans seem to perceive seems to imply that they have temporal lobe epilepsy, or at least elements of temporal lobe epilepsy, because many, many shamans are epileptic. So clearly this is where the channels are opened, and this is where the future is seen. The skill is learning how to interpret and channel that information and use it effectively.
It must be very hard, because the daemon obviously only speaks to you in images and symbols and archetypes, right?
It depends. I would say that depending upon that great Gnostic philosopher, writer, and artist, William Blake, again a term I used last time, when he said opening the doors of perception. And he said if we'd open the doors of perception and cleanse the doors of perception, we would see reality as it really is. Now, what I suggest is that with the average normal person, the daemon can only communicate in symbols, dream symbols, Jungian archetypes, that type of thing. But for a temporal lobe epileptic, the communication can be much more direct. Indeed, on my forum, I have about 5 or 6 people who experience temporal lobe epilepsy, whose daemon is a regular part of their lives. The daemon is with them continually. Do you remember the story of Socrates? Socrates claimed that all through his life his daemon was with him. The daemon used to tell Socrates whether to go out or not, whether it was going to rain. It gave him such mundane predictions. I also contend that, say, Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc's voices. Joan of Arc, it has long been argued, had temporal lobe epilepsy, a particular sort that was stimulated by the bells. In the story, she hears the bells and she hears the voices. She hears the church bells and she hears the voices. There's something called musicogenic temporal lobe epilepsy. The seizures are stimulated by a certain sound. Now, her voices guided her. Her voices told her what to do throughout her career. And the voices are specific. When somebody moves into schizophrenia, the voices become garbled. It's almost as if the signal is there's other signals coming through and there's other voices coming through, as if they're attuning to something different. And that's when they become confused. I'd also suggest that under certain circumstances, your daemon will manifest itself as an image of yourself in front of you. There is a known psychological effect called autoscopy. And autoscopy is also known as doppelganger syndrome. And I was amazed when I found that this was a known effect of the mind. People who have autoscopy see themselves standing in front of themselves. And this being that's standing in front of them, this doppelganger, will sometimes speak to them. And they will usually warn the person of an upcoming danger. Now, as you're probably aware, in Eastern European tradition, to see your own double is a harbinger of death. And because this is normal, because the daemon will manifest itself to warn you not to do something. For instance, Shelley, the poet, before his death and before he decided to make his fateful journey in Italy in a boat called the Ariel, his own double appeared to him and warned him to not travel or to not. He said, "Are you happy?" and then disappeared. So sometimes the daemon in desperation will manifest itself in a very direct way, but I think the neurological channels have to be open in a particular way in order to do that.
And another interesting phenomenon which most people A, take for granted or B, dismiss is déjà vu or paramnesia. How does that play into your hypothesis?
Paramnesia is absolutely central to my whole cheating the ferryman hypothesis. Indeed, it was the déjà phenomenon and my own experiences of déjà vu that led me to start on the long journey of research, which led me to the cheating the ferryman hypothesis. And déjà vu is a precognition. It's a short-term precognition. It's a short-term awareness of what is about to happen next. Now, interestingly enough, one of the known symptoms of temporal lobe epilepsy, and one of the symptoms that neurologists use to decide whether somebody has temporal lobe epilepsy or not, is repeated déjà vu sensations. It's central to it. When somebody starts with déjà vu, that's what they'll start experiencing, déjà vu. Or technically déjà vécu, because as you know, déjà vu means already seen, whereas déjà vécu means already lived. And it's the idea that they will feel that they've lived this moment before. Now, surprisingly enough, 70% of the population, a normal population, experience déjà vu at least once in their lives. It is the most common, inexplicable psychological circumstance. Now, there have been various suggestions put forward as to what déjà vu may be caused by. And there's one famous suggestion made by a guy called Robert Efron. And Efron suggested that it's part of your brain processing information before another part, called diplopia. It's the diplomia. It's the idea that you perceive something twice. There's been recent research done which shows that that cannot be correct, because although the eyes work in a way that you can perceive something twice visually, people who are profoundly blind and have been born blind actually have aural déjà vu sensations. They hear the same thing twice. And the brain isn't wired in that way in order to explain how you can hear something twice. So clearly déjà vu or the déjà sensation is a much deeper, profounder experience. And I think déjà vu is the major clue to my cheating the ferryman hypothesis. Because I have people, again on my forum, and people that come to my talks who will stand up in front of the audience and they'll turn around and say, they've had déjà vu experiences where they know what's going to happen for the next 2 or 3 minutes. They can't, but the strange thing is, many of them say they can't communicate this knowledge. And there's one young lad that I deal with who has a growth on his pineal gland in his brain. He has occasional seizures, and he also has profound déjà vus. And I asked him when he has the déjà vus what it's like, and he said, I know what's going to happen for the next 2 minutes. I know what people are going to say to me. And in order to stop myself going mad, I have to say the words before they say them in my head. And I said to him, so why don't you say, I know what you're going to say next? And he said a very wise thing. He said, well, if I do that, the person won't say the thing I expected them to say. They'll say something different, and I'll have changed the future. So he said, and I haven't got the power to change the future. So clearly there's something very odd about the déjà feeling and the déjà sensation.
And again, changing the future isn't really changing the future in a Newtonian universe. It is simply entering another stream of reality that the daemon has chosen for you, or you listen to the daemon.
Correct. Yes, what you do is by making a choice or by acting upon an action of what your daemon does. I'll give an example of this, a classic where the daemon saves somebody's life. There is a guy that wrote to me who now lives in South Africa, but originally in 1969 he was a member of the Rhodesian Special Forces, when Rhodesia was, before it became Zimbabwe. And he was part of the Special Forces, and he was up in a part in northern Rhodesia called Mount Darwin. And he was riding shotgun on the top of an armored vehicle, and he had a submachine gun in front of him. And as they were driving along, as they came round a corner, a voice in his head turned round and said, "Ambush, ambush, ambush." He was so stunned by the sound of hearing a voice in his head, he didn't move. And the next thing, he was physically, and he described this to me, he said, I was physically pushed out of the seat I was sitting in into the camouflage webbing at the side of the armoured vehicle. As that happened, machine gun fire raked straight across the seat that he was sitting on. As he said, 3 bullets hit that seat. It would have hit him in the throat, the stomach, and in the groin. He would have died instantly. As it was, he didn't. Now, even he said to me, he said, I am absolutely convinced that had I not listened to that voice, I would have died. But I am now living because of that voice, and I'm living in a universe that I didn't die. But in the original universe, I did die.
And speaking historically, could you maybe give us maybe a couple of the greatest clairvoyants you know?
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming the most famous one has to be Nostradamus, right?
Yes, Nostradamus, Michael de Notre Dame, was, by all affairs, an incredibly talented individual. Now, if you go back and you look at his quatrains, the 4-line verses that he wrote, which were placed, I think, into about 5 or 6 collections of 100 the centuries, what is fascinating, if you look at Nostradamus, is that his fame in his own lifetime was amazing because he made some phenomenal descriptions and phenomenal, very, very precise predictions about what was about to happen. One of the most famous one was the death of, I think it was Henry IV, I may stand corrected on this, the French king. And Nostradamus wrote something along the lines of, "The young lion shall vanquish the old, in field of combat, in a cage of gold, with eyes destroyed, will take 3 days to die." Now, that's how the quatrain reads. What happened was that the Henry IV was jousting, and he had a gold helmet, like a cage. And he was jousting with a young Scottish knight called Montgomery. It's amazing how my memory works sometimes, you know. I'm just sitting here remembering all this. It's really weird when you have a mind like mine. And as Montgomery was coming towards him, he raised up his lance. And in raising up the lance, it shattered the eyes of the king. And 3 days later, he died in absolute agony. Now, this is exactly what Nostradamus predicted. Literally, you know, the cage of gold, eyes destroyed, will take 3 days to die. The young lion shall vanquish the old. I think I'm even right in saying that both of them had lion insignias on their coats of arms. His fame was so great that he was called to court, and people knew about him and his fame. The interesting thing is, though, that if you start looking at his predictions after his own death, his accuracy suddenly falls off phenomenally. Now, I know there are many people that will turn around and say that he predicted Hitler. Other people will say he predicted Napoleon. But if you actually look closely at the quatrains and you look at the translations, you will realize that people have adapted them. Because as you probably know, Nostradamus used to write in French. He also used to write in language, the language of southern France, the Languedoc. And he'd also write in Latin. And he'd also use anagrams. So it was very difficult for these later quatrains to actually decide what he was saying. For instance, people say he predicted Napoleon. Well, he didn't. What he did was he mentioned 3 French towns, Naples and Lauron, which people have put together to say Napoleon. So if you look at his predictions, you will find that they're not as accurate after he died. And I argue that was because he could only predict things in his own future life, i.e. in the time that would take place between when he was then and his own death. After that, his accuracy fails. It's not as good. And I'd argue that's because we can only remember our own future. If we are dead in the future and after we die, it's something we can't possibly know, nor can our Daemon know because we've already died.
Is there another clairvoyant that comes to mind that you have an affinity to?
Oh, yeah. My favorite one is a guy called Robert Nixon. And Robert Nixon lived very close to where I live in Cheshire in England. in a place called Vale Royal. And he lived in around about the 1480s. And he was a very simple ploughman. He was known for being very simple. And one day, he was ploughing the field, and he went into one of his seizures. Clearly, he was a temporal lobe epileptic. And in his seizure state, he started running around the field and shouting out, saying, "Up at him, Henry! Richard is down! Richard is down! Henry, we have a new king! We have a new king!" People were so amazed by this that they made notes of it. Around about 2 weeks later, a message comes through from the south of England to say that a great battle had taken place at Bosworth Field, and Richard III, the English king, had been killed in battle, and the new king was named Henry VII. People locally were so amazed that this simple ploughman had seen this event. And the message got down to London, and the people in London sent up an emissary from the king, because the king wanted to have Richard down in the court in London, because he was so amazed at this guy's precognitive abilities, he wanted him to be a member of the court. About 6 hours before the emissary arrived in Sandyway, which is the village that Robert Nixon lived in, Nixon turned round to his family and said, "Don't let the man take me away. I'll starve to death. Please don't let the man take me to London." The guy turned up, and they already knew he was coming, so he was stunned when they said, "No, Robert has already announced you're coming, and we know that you're going to take him down to London." What then happened was they convinced Robert that they would give him a chef that would be with him 24 hours a day to make sure he didn't starve. Nixon goes down to London and stays with the king for 2 or 3 years. The cooks cook him his food, but he became a nuisance. He used to pester them for food all the time. And one day, one of the cooks got so exasperated with him, he locked him in the scullery of the castle. Unfortunately, that was the day that Henry decided to change castles, and everybody forgot that Robert was in the scullery, and he starved to death, exactly as he predicted it would be.
Ugh, that's gruesome.
Isn't it? And again, his Daemon knew and was desperate. He was screaming at him, literally saying, "Robert, do not allow yourself to go down to London, you will starve to death." But because he couldn't get his message across, he failed. Now, the funnier side of that is that Robert Nixon was once asked, if the end of the world took place, where would the safest place in the world to be? And he turned round and he said, "When the end of the world shall come to be, the safest place shall be God's holy acre twixt Mersey and Dee." Now, that's a place called the Wirral Peninsula, which is where I'm sitting making this phone call from. So clearly, we are safe here, according to Robert Nixon.
And lastly, what are some instances of people, or one instance of people meeting the doppelganger? Because I'm sure that's something the listener will be worrying about after our talk.
My favorite story of a doppelganger saving somebody's life was the German composer Gluck. And again, it's how my brain is working here. Gluck was staying in Ghent in Belgium. And he'd been out for a few drinks with his friends. He was staying in lodgings, and he'd been out for a few beers or a few drinks with his friends. And he was walking back through the streets, back to his digs, when he noticed a figure walking in front of him wearing identical clothes to him. He followed the figure and watched the figure go into the front door of the digs he was staying at. And as the figure got to the door, it looked round, and it was him. It was his own double. It was his doppelganger. Gluck was so terrified by this, he took himself back to his friends in the pub, and people witnessed this, and he said, "I've just seen my own double. I'm not going back to those digs tonight. Can somebody put me up for the night?" Which they did. His friends then drop him off the next morning at the digs, and there's all furore going on. They go upstairs, and in the room that Gluck would have slept that night, the roof had collapsed. And the roof had come down and crashed all over Gluck's bed. Had Gluck gone through that door and slept that night, he would have been killed. This was before he wrote all his famous operas and everything else. The doppelganger was so desperate to stop his eidolon doing something that it manifested itself as a double and warned him that way. And I love that story because it is so encapsulates the whole idea of the daemon as protector.